It is believed that the meaning of the Brereton name is place of the briar. Our crest is of a muzzled bear, and our motto is Oputilant Dio, with the aid of God. We can reliably trace our family tree back to the Norman conquest of 1066. It is believed that the Breretons who followed William the Conqueror came from the Brereton area of France, now known as Brittany. This area was home to the Breton people, an ethnic group who immigrated from southwestern England primarily during the 5th to 6th centuries, due to the Anglo-Saxon invasion when an influx of Germanic peoples arrived in Britain, creating Anglo-Saxon settlements and greatly altering the culture. The first recorded instance of the Brereton name can be found in the Battle Abbey Roll. Battle Abbey was a monument built on the site of the Battle of Hastings of 1066, which marked the beginning of the Norman conquest of England under William the Conqueror. Battle Abbey Roll is a document that lists the names of the 629 chiefs of the Norman nobles who followed William to victory. During the invasion, Saxon landowners were displaced and those loyal to William were given their lands. The lands our ancestor received were in the Cheshire area. The next written instance of her name is in the Domesday Book, a census undertaken by William the Conqueror to determine, for taxation purposes, all the people, land, stock, and property in England. This great survey was conducted from 1086 to 87. It is written in abbreviated medieval Latin. I saw one translation as the Breretons having 240 acres, 24 oxen, a meadow, forest, and mill. We're now jumping ahead 400 years to Sir Randall Brereton IV of Malpas. He was knighted by King Henry VII in 1509 and made the Chamberlain of Chester, a position that was renewed when King Henry VIII came to the throne. He fought for King Henry VIII in France and was knighted a second time after the Battle of the Spurs in 1503. He married Eleanor Dutton in 1502 and they had 13 children. Eleanor also came from a noble family that can trace its roots back to a cousin of William the Conqueror. This respected couple are buried in a marble tomb in the Brereton Chapel of St. Oswald's Church in Malpas. Their son, Sir William Brereton, was a groom of the chamber to King Henry VIII. He got caught up in the allegations of infidelity laid against Anne Boleyn by King Henry VIII. He, along with some others, were accused of treason for supposedly having affairs with Anne Boleyn. These trumped-up charges led to his execution as well as hers. Another of Sir Randall's sons, Urien, was also a groom to the chamber of King Henry VIII, a position that he survived. He built the beautiful Hanforth Hall. An interesting side note is that his grandson, Ambrose Barlow, was canonized. He was one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales canonized by Pope Paul VI for keeping and preaching the Catholic faith in England after Charles I proclaimed that all priests must leave the country or be tried as traitors. He refused to leave and was tried for treason and executed in 1641. Another son of Sir Randall and Eleanor is our ancestor, Reverend John Brereton of Malpas. Not much is known about Reverend John. He was the rector of the St. Oswald's Church in Malpas. He married Alice, born in 1504. At some point he moved to Suffolk, and then possibly Norfolk, for he is considered the start of the Norfolk branch of the family. Reverend John lived during a turbulent religious period. He was born during the reign of King Henry VIII, when the Church of England broke away from Catholicism. Under his successor, Edward VI, England became even more Protestant, with many aspects of Roman Catholic practices being eradicated. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, and clergy were now allowed to marry. When Mary I, formerly Queen of Scots, succeeded Edward, she restored the Church of England back to papal authority. Then, when Queen Elizabeth I succeeds, she brings the Church of England back to Protestantism, causing Pope Pius V to publish a papal bull excommunicating all who obey Elizabeth I and calling on all Catholics to rebel. It was noted that our ancestor, Reverend John, was an ardent pluralist, that he believed that the existence of different beliefs and opinions in society was a good thing, even though the kings and queens of his time thought otherwise. The idea that our line of the family came from Brereton Hall has long been believed. The obituary of my great-uncle Charles in 1908 even mentions it. However, our line of the family left for the Norfolk area prior to Brereton Hall being constructed. The hall was built in 1586 by Sir William Brereton, and it's thought that Queen Elizabeth I laid the foundation stone. This line of the Brereton family had lived on the land where the hall was built for 600 years, spanning 22 generations, until in 1722, when Francis Brereton died a bachelor with no offspring, and the estate was sold outside of the family. Back to our line, which is referred to as the younger line, as in the younger siblings who don't stand to inherit their father's estate. Reverend John's son, William Brereton of Hoxne, married Elizabeth Green and had 6 kids. At some point, he moved to Norfolk. Nothing else is known about him. Cuthbert Brereton was at various times a lawyer, an alderman, and a sheriff. His sheriff's responsibilities were to collect taxes on behalf of Queen Elizabeth I and to bring them to the exchequer. He would also help the mayor in maintaining law and order. As alderman, Cuthbert was a high-ranking official who exercised judicial, administrative, or military functions. The British judicial system stemmed from the Anglo-Saxon era. In 1558, there were only 200 active lawyers in Britain. If you were accused of a crime, you were jailed until your trial. Trials tended to be quick and skewed in favor of the prosecution. The convicted's fate was determined by a judge or an official. Those of noble blood usually received less severe punishment. Reverend John Brereton was the pastor of St. Peter Mancroft Church in Norwich. In 1602, John became part of Bartholomew Gosnold's voyage to the shores of present-day New England. He was brought aboard to be the chronicler of the expedition, which he subsequently published. They left England aboard the Concord and explored the North American coastline from roughly present-day Portland, Maine, down to Martha's Vineyard. In his published account, John describes the flora and fauna, the lay of the land, the inhabitants they met, and items they traded and the goods they brought back to England. Some scholars believe that William Shakespeare drew his inspiration for his play The Tempest from those writings, and that Prospero's Island in the play is based on the island of Cuttyhawk that John described. After returning to England, John lived a quiet life, becoming the rector of Brightwall in Suffolk, and then the rector of St. Peter Mancroft in Norwich. He married Margaret, and they had 3 children together. Little is known about Reverend John's eldest son, John Brereton, other than he lived in Shottisham. He married Mary in 1628, and they had 5 children together. Their son John married Cicely Cook, the heiress to Brereton Hall estate. Cicely's father was a landowner and tanner. The estate most likely had tenant farmers. The landowner would provide the land to the tenant farmer, who worked the land and paid rent in either produce, cash, or a combination of the two. Upon his marriage to Cicely, John became known as John Brereton I of Brereton. They had 5 children together. Brereton Hall remained in the Brereton family until 1910. 2 of John and Cicely's sons, William, our ancestor, and John, the heir to Brereton Hall, lived together in Leatheringset Hall for a period of time until the death of their father, when John returned to Brereton to become John Brereton II of Brereton. William was a lawyer, and he married Anne Shorting. who was the niece of Admiral Cloudesley Shovel, whose fleet took Gibraltar from Spain in 1703. They had 5 children together. When William's brother John II of Brereton died childless, the estate passed on to William's son John, who became John Brereton III of Brereton. He was an importer and trader of non-perishable foods, selling his wares as far as London. He married Bridget Brett, and they had 9 children. Abel Brereton was the twin to his slightly older brother John, who became John Brereton IV of Brereton, and who married Anna Margarita Lloyd and followed into his dad's grocery business. Meanwhile, Abel inherited some land and married Anne Rouse. After Anne's death, Abel married Elizabeth Lloyd, sister to his twin John's wife, Anna Margarita. They were first cousins. Abel and Elizabeth had 3 children together. One being my great-great-grandfather, Cloudesley Shovel Brereton. Cloudesley emigrated to British Guiana in 1818. This territory held many sugar plantations which unconscionably used slavery. According to Great Uncle Charles' obituary, he stayed with the territorial governor. As this obituary stretched the truth in a few areas, this must be taken with a grain of salt. Regardless, at some point Cloudesley relocated to New Hampshire and then onwards to Ontario. When Cloudesley first arrived in Toronto, he was a merchant. Then he eventually moved to East Gwillimbury, where he farmed. He married Charlotte Fisher in 1844, and they had 8 children together. All I know about Charlotte is that she was born in Gwillimbury, Ontario. Cloudesley's half-sister Anne and her family also lived in Ontario. Her husband, William Copeland, wrote many letters to a friend in England. In some of these letters, he described the events of the Rebellion of Upper Canada in 1837. These letters were compiled and published in 1838. Their sons were in the military fighting against William Lionel Mackenzie, one of the leaders of the rebellion. William Copeland also got involved in some of the skirmishes, and at one point Cloudesley Shovel joined in. Cloudesley and Charlotte's eldest child was my great-uncle Charles Herbert. At 19, he attended the Victoria School of Medicine, and after graduating, he went to Bethany, Ontario, and practiced medicine there for 40 years. He was the first doctor to reside and practice in Bethany, going to see his patients in a horse and buggy. He was very active in the community, acting in plays and singing in the choir and being a Freemason. He married Eliza Proctor in 1876, and they had 8 children together. In 1881, Charles was elected as the Conservative member of the provincial parliament for Durham East. He was re-elected in 1883, but ill health led him to resign his seat in 1886. He died in 1908. My great-grandfather, Thomas George Brereton, was Cloudesley and Charlotte's youngest son. He also studied medicine at the Victoria School of Medicine, and after graduating, he also went to Bethany and set up practice there. From then on, he was known as the young doctor, and his brother Charles as the old doctor. He bought a house on the main street where he opened the first drugstore in town. His medical practice was at the back of the store, and the family lived above. Thomas George married Letitia Hulse in 1884. Letitia's great-grandparents, my 4th great-grandparents, Thomas Hulse and Hannah Taylor, were born in Nottingham, England, and married in 1797. They had 11 children. Thomas supported his family as a baker. His eldest son, Thomas, married Mary Smith in 1824. They had 7 children together. Thomas, and eventually his 2 eldest sons, Joseph and John, were all lace manufacturers at a pivotal time for that industry. At the time, Nottingham was well known for its lace that was painstakingly created by hand. In the early 1800s, a machine was invented that could produce lace. This disruption caused the fall of handmade lace making as the price collapsed. Many traditional textile workers, wanting to get rid of the machinery that they felt was destroying their livelihood, started a movement in Nottingham in 1811, where the workers would break into the factories and destroy the machines. These people were called Luddites, and their means of protest spread throughout England for the next 5 years. These factories were dangerous, loud, and dirty. Perhaps that's why in 1842 Thomas and Mary made the decision to move to Canada with their children aged 3 to 16. Our ancestor, John Smith-Hulse, was 15 years old. The family settled in Pottageville, Ontario, living in a 2-story clapboard building. Thomas was a school teacher and also ran an inn out of their house, which employed 3 people. Thomas and Mary's third son, my great-great-grandfather, John Smith-Hulse, became a tavern keeper. He married Letitia Moore in 1852. Letitia Moore was born in Clogher, Tyrone, Ireland in 1826. This makes her 19 years old in 1845 when the potato famine started in Ireland. Whether Letitia was affected by the famine isn't known, as I can find no record of her parents or even when Letitia came to Canada. The first mention of her in Canada is her marriage record. So sometime prior to 1852, she made her way, by herself or with her family, to Ontario from Ireland. After Letitia and John married in 1852, they had 6 children, one dying in infancy. In 1868, John returned to England to visit family. On one of the legs of the week-long journey by boat, he died, and as was done at the time, he was buried at sea. This left 36-year-old Letitia, a widow with 5 children, ranging in age from 2 to 12 years. Her daughter, Letitia Hulse, who would eventually marry Thomas George Brereton, would have been 6 years old. How they managed is unknown. The 1871 census shows that Letitia wasn't working. In the 1881 census, Letitia wasn't working, but her 2 eldest sons were. Joseph, age 21, was a cabinet maker, and Matthew, age 19, was a clerk. In 1884, Letitia Moore's youngest daughter, Letitia Hulse, age 21, married Dr. Thomas George Brereton, age 24, and moved to Bethany. They had 4 sons, the eldest being my grandfather, Frederick Elvin, born in 1885, then Charles Hulse in 1887, Henry Picton in 1889, who died in 1892, Frank Marvin in 1893, and finally Lily Letitia in 1899. Thomas George was very active in the Bethany community. He served on the school board and funded the purchase of some land and the building of a 2-room schoolhouse where their children attended. He was the first person in Bethany to own a car, which generated lots of stares and skepticism of its usefulness in such rolling countryside. He was very generous in giving people rides. In November of 1911, a great fire raced through Bethany's main street, destroying many of the buildings, including Thomas's drugstore, medical office, and home. Thomas helped to fight the fire, and they were able to contain it to one side of the street. Thomas caught pneumonia that night, and without any antibiotics at the time, he never recovered. He died on December 10, 1911. His youngest child, Lily, was only 12. My grandfather, Frederick Elvin, was 26 when his father, Thomas George, died. He too wanted to become a doctor, but a hearing impairment prevented that. Instead, he attended the Guelph Agricultural College. After graduating, he got a job at the Farmers' Dairy in Toronto, where he was responsible for the milk delivery drivers and their horses. This position provided him with the funds to purchase a house in 1914, 76 Rosemount Drive in Toronto. He lived there with his mother Letitia, his brother Frank Marvin, and his sister Lily, who suffered from debilitating arthritis. Frederick's brother, Frank Marvin, caught what may have been the Spanish flu, which was spreading at the time. After battling the illness for 16 days, he died at Fred's house on October 14, 1918. He was 25 years old. The Spanish flu struck Canada hard between 1918 and 1920, killing approximately 50,000 people in Canada. How Fred met his wife, Pearl Annette O'Keefe, is unknown. Pearl's paternal great-grandparents were John O'Keefe and Margaret Devine. They married on January 12, 1833 in Toronto. I can find no further information on them, but an unsubstantiated family tree I saw has them both coming from Ireland. Their son and Pearl's grandfather, William John O'Keefe, was born in Canada, and he worked as a printer. He married Hannah Hannafin. Hannah's parents and Pearl's great-grandparents are listed on Hannah's wedding certificate as Daniel Hannafin and Anne Carter. Since Hannah was born in Ireland, in the county of Kerry, I assumed they were Irish. I couldn't find any records of the family in Ireland. It's the Canadian census records that tells us where Hannah was born. Hannah was 7 years old when the Irish potato famine began. At the time, 1/3 of Ireland's population was dependent on potatoes for survival. So when the potato blight ravaged their crops, ruining up to 3/4 of the harvest each year, it led to mass malnutrition and starvation. Approximately 1 million people died, and another 2 million left Ireland in search of a better life. If Hannah came to Canada during the famine, she most likely came with her family due to her age. All we really know is that Hannah was in Canada in 1858 when she married William John O'Keefe. The 1871 census shows them living in Toronto with 5 children ranging in age from 8 to 1 years old. According to the 1881 census, William O'Keefe and Hannah were still living in Toronto with their 5 children. William was still a printer, and his 3 eldest children were also working. Richard, 17, was a painter, Mary, 16, was a dressmaker, and our ancestor John, 15, a varnisher. I found no mention of any of the O'Keefes in the 1891 census. At some point, my great-grandfather John married Mary Ellen Collinson, and they had 3 children, my grandmother Pearl, William, and John. Tragically, Mary Ellen died on January 26, 1901, at the age of 26. My grandmother Pearl was around 7 years old. The 1901 census tells us that John, age 36, is widowed and that he's employed in a factory as a burnisher, making $576 a year. His 2 sons, William, 5, and John, 1, are living with him, as is his younger brother, William, age 29. Also living there was Susan Hiltz, 32, who is listed as the housekeeper. There's no mention of Grandma Pearl, who would have been 8. In 1904, John and the housekeeper, Susan Hill, were married. They ended up having 4 children together. Pearl was 11 when her father remarried. She never got along with her stepmother, who treated her very poorly. Pearl's father, John, died in April of 1911. According to the 1911 census, Pearl, age 17, was still living at home. She had worked for at least the past year as an operator at Whiteware Factory that made undergarments, working 54 hours a week and earning $240 a year. Her younger brother, William, age 13, worked also for the past year as a cutter in a leather factory, also earning $240. I assume that Pearl's father had been too ill to work for a period of time before his death, so Pearl and her 13-year-old brother had to work to bring money into the household. Susan, the stepmother, was not working. Pearl and her stepmother never got along. My father said his mother never held a grudge against anyone except her stepmother. Some 40 years later, Pearl still refused to see her. So it's no surprise to see in the 1921 census that 27-year-old Pearl was living as a boarder with her cousins, Frederick and Evelyn Williams. She was a clerk at a grocer, earning $780. Both of Pearl's brothers, William and John, fought in World War I. They both enlisted in 1916. William signed up when he was 18 and John at only 16. They both fought at Vimy Ridge. On May 1st, 1917, William wrote home that he was busy driving the Germans back where they belonged, and that as he wrote, he could hear the big artillery guns roaring about him. According to a friend and fellow soldier, the next day he was buried by a German shell, but was dug out unharmed. William commented to his friend about his narrow escape. The next morning, May 3rd, at 4 a.m., their battalion went over the trenches, which signaled the beginning of the Battle of Fresnoy. William had gone only a short distance when a shell burst nearby. The concussion of that blast killed him instantly. He was one of 1,259 Canadian casualties during that battle. His brother John survived that battle and the war. After the war, he moved to Detroit. His body was never recovered. His name is etched on the Vimy Ridge Memorial. He was one of 3,598 Canadian soldiers who died during the campaign for Vimy Ridge. It's not known how Pearl and Fred met, but they married in 1922. Pearl took over the running of the house and the caring of the family from his mother, Letitia. Letitia and Lily continued living with them till their deaths, Letitia in 1931 and Lily in 1932. Fred and Pearl had 3 sons, Frank William, born in 1923, Thomas Elvin, born in 1925, who died in 1928, just before the birth of George Hulse. Just as the Great Depression set in, Fred lost his job when the Farmers' Dairy merged with the Acme Dairy in 1929. He never held a full-time job again. He would pick up odd jobs, such as bill collecting. My dad remembered going on some calls with him. Despite this setback, the family was more comfortable than most. Fred had saved some money and possibly had an inheritance from his father. However, they lived very frugally. This was especially true after Fred had a stroke in 1935, leaving him unable to speak. Over the years, his condition deteriorated, and he died in 1942. This is my dad, George's, memory of that day. I remember that day. I was 13 and sitting in school when I was told to go home. My dad was not expected to live. I walked home, alone, crying. George goes on to say, "This left my mom at age 47 with 2 rambunctious teenagers and an income of $125. She owned the house, but she was not allowed to encroach on the capital, as that was willed to Frank and I. Eventually, with inflation, the stipend proved insufficient. The will provided for capital encroachment for our education, so we convinced the trust company that Mom needed more money to keep us as we grinded our way through university. The hero of all of this was Mom. Now, many years too late, I can appreciate how difficult her life was. I'll always remember her as a happy, stoic, warm woman. She passed away of cancer." Frank was a brilliant student, so it's no surprise that he followed in the footsteps of his grandfather, Thomas George, his great-uncle Charles Hulse, and his uncle Charlie, and became a doctor. He studied at the University of Toronto. He met and married Joyce Mortson, a nurse at Northwestern Hospital in Toronto, where they both worked. They had 3 children, Cindy, Sandra, and William. He died in 1981 and Joyce died in 2001. George graduated in 1950 from the University of Toronto with a degree in finance and commerce. He got a job with the Canadian Oil Company as a salesman. He said the best thing about that job was meeting Marjorie Mainland, who he married in 1951. Marjorie's family is traced in another video. Marge and George had 5 children. Jean, born in 1953, Frank in 1954, John in 1957, Mary in 1959, and Kathleen in 1961. In 1953, George started working at Sunoco and began taking night courses to get his MBA. He worked his way up the corporate ladder to the vice president level, where he held various positions during his time there. In 1973, Frank, having just turned 19, moved out to British Columbia. He loved the outdoors and wildlife, so it was a good fit for him. He eventually settled in Prince Rupert and got a job as a mate on a tugboat. Frank's letters home were thoughtful and chatty and peppered with humor. They showcase a young man trying to find his place in the world. He had one experience that showed his character. In December of 1974, a pleasure craft with a couple and their 3-year-old daughter ran into a gale and quickly became imperiled. One nearby tugboat tried to attempt a rescue but had to turn back in the heavy seas. The owner of the tugboat company that Frank worked for learned of this impending disaster. He figured he only had one boat that had a chance of surviving these sea conditions. He asked for volunteers to attempt the rescue, and Frank accepted the risk. Off they went in 30-foot seas with winds gusting up to 85 miles an hour. It was a feat and a miracle that they were even able to locate the distressed boat and get all 3 passengers onto their boat. The journey back to port was just as harrowing. With the engines failing, they limped into the safety of port. Afterwards, all on board confessed that they had felt that they would not make it. The full story of this rescue can be found in the book Dangerous Waters. It seems that every generation endures hardship. It's part of life. One that our family faced came in 1975 when Frank died. Frank was working on the tug Ripto Rogue, towing a barge from Masset on Haida Gwaii to Prince Rupert. A lighthouse keeper, noticing some barge lights that weren't moving, called in an emergency. The sea conditions were bad. When rescuers arrived, they found that the tugboat had sunk, but that it was still attached by the towing cable to the still floating barge. All 6 crew members were lost. It is unknown what caused the tugboat to sink. Frank's death was a devastating blow, but, as these past generations have shown, you find a way to carry on. Marge and George were avid downhill skiers. They loved spending time at the cottage and traveling. In George's memoirs, he talks about their many trips. I counted 41 trips they had done up to 1998. To ease into retirement, George left Sunoco and became the executive director of the Ontario Petroleum Association, where he could work more stable hours. He did that for 6 years before retiring at the age of 62. As they aged, Marge and George wintered first in Arizona and then Florida, and spent the spring through the fall at the cottage, surrounded by their growing family. George had some heart issues and died May 4th, 2011, at the age of 82. Just a few months shy of their 60th wedding anniversary. Marge died in 2019 in her 91st year. Every generation creates their own legacy. This is one of the legacies that Marge and George left us. In 1966, our family was camping at 6 Mile Lake Provincial Park on a rainy weekend. As an excuse to get out of the weather, Marge and George decided to drop in on a realtor to see about some land they had noticed for sale on the lake. They ended up buying that land and building a cottage on it. That cottage quickly became a loved second home to everyone in the family. Many years later, when the neighboring cottage came up for sale, they bought it too, so they could better accommodate the growing family and spend summers with their children and grandchildren. How they loved that. These cottages have become a very special place for 4 generations. What a wonderful gift. What an incredible legacy.